Archaeology is definitely going through a transformation. And there is a kind of a tug of war right now between what are known as the new archaeologists who are embracing all the latest technologies, um, like, just radar penetration below the surface or high level radar scanning of areas. One example of that was used in Egypt, and they discovered 100 sites that nobody even knew existed because they could see them just below the surface of the ground using these techniques.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a kind of a quiet revolution going on in archaeology because new technologies are being applied to the old. But what it's creating is a new narrative of the past. And the older established archaeologists are really not happy with this new narrative because it's, many of them had their careers made on a certain book describing, life in Egypt in 800 BC that is now being thrown out by these new narratives. So there's a lot of tension in archaeology now. But I do think more and more is going to be discovered. Even in America, you wouldn't think it, but even in America, there's increasing amount of evidence that we have evidence of really significantly old civilizations right in America.
Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Cuello, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading-edge studies in science and consciousness, spirituality, healing, philosophy, and we also have, in addition to our online presentations with guest speakers, we offer classes and study groups, which are also on Zoom. And we have over 100 video recordings on our YouTube channel, which is Caritas Consciousness Project. And you can also access them through our website, which is caritascenter.org. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep us going, to keep this program going. If you'd like to support this program, you can make a donation or become a member on our website. And now let me introduce tonight's guest speaker. Joseph Selbie is the author of Paradigm Changing the Physics of Miraculous Healing, which was his last presentation on Caritas. A polymath, Joseph is known for creating bridges of understanding between the modern evidence-based discoveries of science and the timeless experience-based discoveries of the mystics. He is also the author of The Physics of God, a unification of science and religion. Break through the limits of the brain, neuroscientific support for spiritual experience, and the Yugas, which is the book we'll be talking about this evening, a factual look at India's tradition of cyclical history and human development, I would add. He has presented at many conferences and has appeared on numerous programs, including the Chopra Well with Deepak Chopra, Coast to Coast with George Noory, Gaia's Open Minds with Regina Meredith, and Buddha at the Gas Pump with Rick Archer. He was nominated Trailblazer of the Decade by Om Times magazine and appears with Elizabeth Rome in 2014 docudrama Finding Happiness. a dedicated Kriya Yoga meditator for over 50 years. He has taught yoga, meditation, and universal experiential spirituality throughout the United States and Europe. In 1975, Joseph became a member of Ananda, a spiritual movement inspired by the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda, author of Autobiography of a Yogi. And if you'd like to see his presentations of the other books that he's written, The Physics of Miraculous Healing, The Physics of God, Break Through the Limits of the Brain, you can find those on YouTube, our YouTube channel as well. Joseph Selbie, who has been, this is your fourth time with us, Joseph.
Yeah.
You just keep writing these wonderful books. So welcome. Thank you so much for being with us this evening and taking the time.
My pleasure to be here again.
Yeah. And we're going to be speaking about this book, Yugas. I'll get that. And what a fascinating book. I just finished it this morning and loved every page, really. Seriously, it is just so interesting. And you'll hear about it, and then you'll know why I say that. So, Joseph, let's start. You studied, you're a follower, a longtime follower of Paramahansa Yogananda, and it was through his work, his teaching, that you learned about the Yugas, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And it was his teacher that came up with this model, this particular model of the Yugas, which is a little bit different from the ancient one from the Hindus, but wasn't, I don't know, maybe you can tell us at some point where the Yugas originated. Was it in the Bhagavad Gita? Was it in the Vedas? And I wonder what made him change it. I suppose it was inspiration, because it certainly seems to make a lot of sense. But
well, it's actually the other way around. It got changed from the way it was in the Vedas and in the laws of Manu. And it was changed by, well-meaning, but perhaps not fully realized people at the period of about 700 BC. They decided that the years that were mentioned in the laws of Manu, which is a 24,000 year cycle, they decided that each year must be a Daiva year, must be a divine year that is much bigger than 1 year, like 1,200 years.
mm,
And so they multiplied the length of the yugas tremendously, so that in India today, the common understanding is that there's still another 420,000 years of the lowest age of the four ages to go
the
before
Kali
we
Yuga.
even get to the next highest age. But Sri Yukteswar said this was just simply a well-meaning mistake, and that in fact the cycle is 24,000 years and
Nice.
and always has been.
Oh, okay. So he actually went to the original. He didn't make this up from the
No,
original.
no.
Okay.
And the original simply says 24,000 years. It doesn't refer to any other concept of the year, the Daiva year, or the divine year, the year of the gods. That was basically created by someone in about 700 or 800 BC.
Mm. Well, let's kind of start at the beginning, and I'll ask you to, for those in the audience who have not been exposed to this model, would you provide a brief overview of the Yuga cycle for us before we get into specific questions?
Sure. So the Yuga cycle originates in India, but it is echoed by other traditions around the world. The one that perhaps most people are familiar with is the Greek system of there having been a golden age, followed by a silver age, a bronze age, and finally an iron age. But it's also in Norse mythology. It's in the Lakota Sioux teachings with white buffalo woman. It's in Australia. It's in South America. It's pretty clear when you look thoroughly at ancient lore that the notion that there was higher ages in the past and that there will be higher ages again in the future was pretty commonly embraced, even as recently as a couple thousand years ago. But the basic idea is expressed through the Yugas, perhaps the most precisely, because as we were just talking in the Vedas, in the laws of Manu, there's a particular number of years given for the length of the cycle, which to my knowledge is not mentioned in any of the other systems that are still in traditional lore. So according to Sri Yukteswar, the teacher of Paramahansa Yogananda, we are in the upward arc of that 24,000 year cycle. And if we go back to 500 AD, that was the low point of the cycle. And if we go back 12,000 years from that, we would be at the high point of the cycle. So if you could think of it as a clock, at 12 o'clock would be the high point, 6 o'clock would be the low point, and the entire time from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock would have taken 12,000 years. And then from 6 o'clock back up to 12 o'clock takes also 12,000 years. And that as the years go by from that high point, mankind as a whole starts with a very high spiritual consciousness, which is known as Satya Yuga. And after about roughly 4,800 years, there is another yuga, another age. Yuga simply means age. So the Yuga cycle is the cycle of ages. So Satya Yuga is the highest, and then we descend into Treta Yuga. And from Treta Yuga, after 3,600 years, we descend into Dwapara Yuga, and then finally into Kali Yuga, which is 1,200 years. So we've now gone on the upswing, and we are entering what is easiest to describe as the ascending Dwapara Yuga, where before I was just moments more before I was talking about the descending arc. We're in the ascending arc, and we're in Dwapara Yuga. So the basic qualities of each of those ages is important to understand. So Satya Yuga is the spiritual age. It's an age in which mankind as a whole can directly perceive spirit. And then in Treta Yuga, still a very high consciousness, but that direct perception of the divine is lost, but mankind as a whole still is able to perceive thought directly. And they're able to use their thoughts to manifest things. And Sri Yukteswar said that the common means of communication in Treta Yuga is mental telepathy. Then mankind loses another level of awareness and moves into Dwapara Yuga, which it becomes more material. Mankind as a whole is more needs to develop agriculture, to develop cities, to develop commerce, and to do things in a more manual way. But still, there is an element of higher awareness compared to the lowest age, in which, because mankind as a whole is aware of life force, they're aware of energy in a general sense, but life force in a very personal sense. So the medicine and the, excuse me, the practices of Dwapara Yuga in the descending arc are very much enabled by an awareness of life force and an individual's ability to use their life force. And then the last age, the lowest age, Kali Yuga, Kali just means dark. It's the dark age of the cycle. And it's a time when mankind as a whole can only understand matter and what the senses can reveal. And the way in which that is exploited is very material. So there's a lot of stonework from that era. There's a lot of muscle power, animal power, water power, all very material in their nature. And then the cycle goes into an upward Kali Yuga, and then finally into the beginning of Dwapara Yuga, where we are today. So that's the picture of it in a nutshell.
Yeah. And so what evidence is there when we talk about a higher, more advanced culture? Like, for instance, I'm trying to remember if there's anything from Satya Yuga that we can use as evidence, but certainly from Treta Yuga, right?
Actually, both. There is good evidence that supports this view of things from Satya Yuga artifacts and building, as well as ancient lore that comes down from that distant past that supports a spiritual understanding. But the actual construction that is kind of a new discovery, it was discovered in the 1990s, is comes to us from Turkey, and it's Göbekli Tepe. Now, Göbekli Tepe is a site, and on that site, which is on the kind of top of a hill, it's not really a mountain or even a foothill, it's just a big hill. And on that, there have been constructed in roughly 10,000 BC these circular rooms, really large rooms that are roofless, and they have a bench running around the inside of the circular wall. They had polished terrazzo floors, as they're called, so there was some finish and sophistication to it. There were these pillars that were sort of came up out of that circular wall that had bas reliefs on them, images of animals, images that were probably symbolic of various levels of truth that involved animals we would never recognize today. And the various circles had alignments to the various stars, the rising of various stars and planets, on the horizon at particular times. So we know from that they had a clear knowledge of astronomy and more likely used it for astrology. But the thing that stands out really about these structures, and there were a lot of them, there were about 20 of them around this one hill, Göbekli Tepe, and then there's another hill nearby where they're unearthing even more of these. Is that the thing that stands out the most is that they're not defensive fortifications. They're not places where people lived. In fact, all around this area, there is no evidence of any human habitation. There are no middens where things were thrown away. There's no ancient evidence of fire circles or any of the evidence that usually surrounds human settlements. What all the evidence suggests is that these circles, these open air rooms, were sacred spaces. They might have been used for meditation. They might have been used for healing. They might have been used for teaching centers, but they certainly weren't used for anything that the common narrative of the development of man, the Darwinian narrative of the development of man, would expect to find, which would be very, very primitive living quarters, according to current thinking. So these spaces that were created were not only built, perhaps, I think it's obvious, but perhaps as sacred spaces, were also deliberately buried after 1,000 or 1,500 years worth of use. This also is very much at variance with anything you would expect from more primitive people. Why did they bury it? Perhaps it was to protect people from powers that had been concentrated in those spaces, that didn't want people to, be overamped by trying to worship or meditate in these spaces, and they needed to be protected. We don't really know, but the fact that they were deliberately buried is very intriguing. And all of this is right in the middle of descending Satya Yuga.
And so that would be what, 13?
Roughly 10,000 BC.
10,000 BC.
So the peak of Satya Yuga was 11,500 BC. So that was the beginning of descending Satya Yuga. It was starting to, from its peak, go down the descending arc of the cycle. So by 10,000 BC, they were, approximately halfway or a third of the way into that descending arc.
And this is what makes it so hard for mainstream science and archaeology to accept it, because we still have this model, this linear model, that it all started with, the cavemen, and we've been progressing ever since, right? Instead of this ascending and descending cycle.
Yeah, and there's the tendency to look back in the past to examine this notion that there were higher ages in the past, to look for technology, because we have technology today. And so we think that this is the mark of a high level of civilization. But it's not really found to the degree. There is technology in descending Dwapara Yuga. They know that they understood electricity. They were able to use batteries to electroplate metal. So there was certain level of use of the knowledge we have today that empowers technology, but it's not widespread. And I think this is because the population back then was far less, and they simply didn't need to develop and exploit technology as we do today in order to have a civilization of, well, we're going on 8 billion people now. In descending Dwapara Yuga, there were probably less than 100 million people around the world. And so living simply would have been natural. But the technology that was exploited, if you will, in descending Dwapara Yuga was the use of life force. And if you look at the way in which that era is viewed by current historians and archaeologists, and the Darwinian approach is they call this the age of magic. The notion that the magic is a real thing is dismissed. So they tend to think of it as having been an age of superstition. What they meant as magic, it's use of life force. It's use of subtle energy to accomplish things. This magical way of living was widespread. It was true in China, it was true in India, it was true in South America, it was true in Egypt. And it was the backbone of civilizations. And the thing that is hard for mainstream scientists and archaeologists to accept is that it worked. There is a hieroglyph on the inside of one of the temples in Egypt that tells a little story. And there is 3 men in a boat. And the man in the front of the boat is has his arm sort of swept out over the water. And the man in the middle of the boat is rowing. And then there's another man at the end of the boat who is well dressed. And the story that's told by the hieroglyphs is that the man in the middle, the owner, has been hired to ferry the wealthy man across the Nile and to herd his cattle across the water. And you can see cows' heads sort of poking up above the water in front of the boat. But the man in the front of the boat is a magician who has been paid to cast a spell on the crocodiles so that they won't eat the cattle. And again, this was not put forward as a quaint fictional story. This was everyday business in Egypt, where people had the ability to affect matter, affect other people, affect animals, using concentrated, focused life force. And you can see it in the medicine in particular. There are many, many Egyptian papyri that display a very high level of knowledge of anatomy and physiology. And they describe how to heal many maladies that we recognize today. And they would include things like poultices and taking herbs. But then they would also always include chants and incantations that the person was meant to use to heal themselves. And they all went together. And you can still see the vestiges of this in Ayurveda. You can certainly see it in traditional Chinese medicine, and you can see it in Egyptian medicine. They all were woven together and were effective. They worked to heal people and keep people healthy. So that was the energy technology of descending Dwapara. the energy technology we have today, at least that we're starting off with, in ascending Dwapara, is exploiting external energy. We're exploiting electricity. We're exploiting solar power. We're exploiting how to use petroleum in various ways. It's all energy based still, but it's energy that is external to us. But we're also seeing in our time that there's a growing awareness of using and experiencing subtle energy, our own life force. We see this in acupuncture. We see this in chiropractic. We see this in meditation. We see this in pranayama, that more and more people, now we're a small minority, but I believe over the hundreds and thousands of years to come in Dwapara Yuga, that the numbers of us who are using our life force will increase, while the number of people who are reliant on the outer forms of exploiting energy will diminish. So that by the time we reach the end of Dwapara Yuga, life force will again become commonly understood, commonly used, and will be the main way in which mankind makes its civilization work.
Right. Yeah. The definition that I was looking for was that the cultures were shaped by magic, which is a combination of the personal awareness of the realm of energy, attunement to spirit, and development of individual powers derived from the use of life force. So exactly what you've just been saying. And it seems that Sri Yukteswar predicted the understanding that we would come to the understanding that energy was the basis of matter, or the underlying property of matter, and that they were essentially the same. About 10 years before Einstein came up with the idea and published his paper on E = mc squared.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sri Yukteswar was prophetic in a way, but not in the usual way in which we think of that term, of seeing something in the future that only he could recognize. Rather, he was prophetic in that he was predicting what this inevitable change of consciousness would result in among all of us, on the earth. And that he saw that by having this deeper knowledge of energy, both inward and outward, that the 20th century would be shaped by exploiting energy, because we know that the basic makeup, the basic foundation of matter is energy. So not long after E = mc squared, we see nuclear energy, and alas, we see nuclear weapons, which are using that knowledge. But we've also started to see solar energy, deeper appreciation for the structure of matter and how we can exploit it for things like computing. And all of that, was sort of foreshadowed by Sri Yukteswar's description of the 20th century.
Yeah. Yeah. And so give us a kind of a rundown of the descending cycle, and in terms of cultures, in terms of civilizations, So we had the civilization that preceded the pyramids, right? Which was still in Satya Yuga. And the pyramids were built in Treta Yuga, is that right?
No, they were built at
Oh,
the very beginning of descending Dwapara.
oh,
So,
descending
so they
Dwapara.
they were very
Okay.
much influenced by the knowledge from Treta Yuga, but they
Right.
actually were constructed in the beginning of descending Dwapara. But
I see.
let me go through that question you had. So
Yeah.
Göbekli Tepe, we don't really have a particular name for a civilization at that time. But if, as Sri Yukteswar describes these ages, it would have been a civilization that lived lightly on the earth, that you would have had people who were as comfortable or more comfortable living under the trees than constructing great edifices for them to live in or to memorialize things. They were had no need to construct, anything major. So probably everything that they did construct was simple. There's evidence suggests that they had looms back at that time, that they knew how to build or make ceramics, to fire clay, to make ceramics. But these are all the simple needs of people who only have simple needs, where what they're really doing is meditating for long hours to deepen that connection to spirit. And if they really need things like food, they could literally, miraculously manifest it. So there's not much more physical evidence than Göbekli Tepe to speak to. And it was in the area of modern day Turkey, but there could have been similar kind of civilizations in India, in China, in South America.
And as you said earlier, all these cultures all over the world have have a tradition of describing this period, the golden age, as you put it.
Right.
The Hopi and all the different cultures all over the world, and had uh, the same tradition of this very advanced age, spiritually speaking. And okay, so then one question that I have, so then, well, okay, I won't get ahead of myself. So then from there, we descended to
Treta
Treta.
Yuga. And then Treta Yuga, again, is still a very high age. You have people who have extraordinary, from our point of view today, extraordinary mental powers, that they could communicate directly and comfortably using mental telepathy. They could manifest things using their mind. They also could become extremely powerful. This is where we first encounter some of what have become the epics of today, like the Ramayana, and the stories of Gilgamesh are likely to have emerged in this period. I think the Greek myths were a little later, may have come along in Dwapara Yuga. But one of the things that you have in the Ramayana and in the Gilgamesh is that you have a heroic leader journeying through the world for some purpose. For Rama, it was to save Sita from a demon, and Gilgamesh has similar kinds of stories. But if you look at that not as, again, a fanciful story meant to entertain, but really ask the question, what were these powerful demons? I think that he really is just referring to people have used mental powers for personal power, or power over others, or to use them as weapons to conquer with. Where you have the enlightened, higher purpose uh, being used by someone like Rama.
Mhm.
The other thing that is common about Treta Yuga around the world is this is really the introduction of the pantheons of the gods. So
Mm.
the oneness that was able to be experienced in Satya Yuga sort of became diluted into multiple gods and goddesses who,
Because they lost that sense of the oneness.
right, the direct perception of
Yeah,
that
the direct
oneness.
experience of that union, right?
But it's very common around the world
Mhm.
that in pretty much every um, ancient culture that has a tradition in its past, you will find pantheons of the gods. You usually have a king of the gods, the queen of the gods, and a god of war, and a god of the wind, a god of the hunt, and so on and so forth. The teachings of India that go back that long are particularly the Vedas. And the Vedas are hymns to various manifestations of God, to this different members of this pantheon. So there were hymns to Brahma, hymns to Indra, hymns to Agni, hymns to Vayu, and on and on. And this again was a practical, useful tool rather than a sort of mythological story. Because by using those hymns to Indra, you could draw Indra's powers to yourself. By using those hymns, those chants to Agni, you could take on the power, the fire-like power of Agni for your own uses. So they were meant to be used rather than, I think as they're viewed today, the hymns are chanted and nothing happens, right?
Mhm.
No one sees anything happen or feels anything happening. And that again makes the modern narrative to see it as just superstitions. But
Yes,
they
but also
actually
as an
work.
externalization, it was like an externalization of the divine, the notion of the divine, instead of being, being part of that, being the same as that in a sense. It became externalized into all these different facets of
Right, right.
right.
Still
Mhm.
very high because you're a high consciousness, much higher than our common level of consciousness is today,
Mhm.
because they could make contact with these different facets of the divine, and they could be uplifted by them. They could be transformed by them. They could be healed by them, and they could be empowered by them. And that's really the nature of all of the hymns in the Vedas. When we reach Dwapara Yuga, that uh, certainly the very high level of consciousness of Satya Yuga is not commonplace. There are enlightened masters who still have it, but even the higher consciousness of Treta Yuga disappears, and mankind is kind of left to do the best it can with the understanding it has and the direct perception it has of life force. So, what I believe began to happen is that mankind, in various ways, in various cultures, wanted to hang on to the highest expression of that past consciousness as they possibly could. They still were close enough to that time to know that there was this higher awareness in the hundreds or 200s or 500 years before them. And so they started using what they knew to keep as many people as possible in that higher consciousness. And so I believe that the pyramids were built as high-minded machines to accelerate spiritual growth among people who, could sort of handle it, that much acceleration of their growth wouldn't fry their nervous system or overwhelm their mind, but it actually would help them grow and become more attuned to divine consciousness. And that over the years, over the centuries after the original pyramids were built, the culture lost touch with what their initial purpose was. They kept building pyramids, but they were poorer and poorer in quality. In my book, there's a picture of a sort of a big mound of sand, essentially, that was originally a pyramid built some 1,000 years after the Great Pyramids were built. And then the civilization, the Egyptian civilization, devolved into a more sort of coercive worship of the gods, whereby doing sacrifices and incantations and exercising of black magic, they wanted the gods to do things for them, to make them successful, to heal their child, whatever it was. And they gradually lost their own ability to channel and embody that power, and it became more and more distant through their worship in the various temples and even in healing and in medicine.
Yeah.
And then you have this again in China, in India. You see this kind of coercive attitude towards these expressions of God, and trying to demand that they do things for the culture or for individuals.
Mm-hmm. And then you have the Greco-Roman era, which was
really the beginning of descending
Kali
Yuga.
Oh, Kali Yuga, yes.
So Kali Yuga begins about 700 BC and goes to 500 AD. So that's 1,200 years. And then from 500 AD in the ascending arc takes us to 1700 AD, which is the beginning of ascending Dwapara Yuga.
Yeah, but I want to point out that we kept losing wisdom and knowledge throughout this descending cycle. So, even what science does accept today, which is like the pyramids were amazing structures that even to this day we don't understand how they could have been built. And then you have the Greco-Roman, and then there's a period within Dwapara Yuga where all books were burned, like the Library at Alexandria, and in China all the books were burned, and so
that was sort of the nadir. That was the low point of Kali Yuga.
Yeah.
Not only did they not, as a civilization, enjoy the understanding that was in those books, they actually destroyed them. And you could say that there was a voluntary amnesia that mankind went into towards the end of descending Kali Yuga. At that lowest point, even the civilization of the Romans, which was pretty crude, was overthrown. It was the
Mhm.
Goths and the Visigoths from the Germanic peoples in the north of Europe invaded Rome, and 500 AD is generally considered to be the fall of Rome. And that is also the nadir of the Yuga cycle. And then
Yeah.
we went into what is generally called by historians the Dark Ages.
Mhm.
So Roman civilization is overthrown, such as it was. I can't say it was particularly civilized. They
Mhm.
enjoyed watching people die in the arena, in the Colosseums. It was a pretty gruesome time,
Yeah.
but at least it was kind of held together by some degree of governing and some degree of taking care of people and protecting them. But when all of that was gone, Europe went into its dark ages. Now, China similarly went into a period where there was no, China and India, there was no one strong leading um, empire. It broke into hundreds of warring factions in China, hundreds of warring factions in um, India. Also, the same thing happened in Central America and South America. So basically, there was nothing for anyone to hang on to. It was a brutal age. The life expectancy back then was about 30 or 35. A few people
Mhm.
lived longer, but most people died of diseases, malnutrition, or war during that time. But it began to swing up again. We got through the dark ages, we got through this just total amnesia. And by the Middle Ages in Europe, we began to see science begin to return, basic
Mhm.
science. And then we saw the Renaissance, which is fascinating because even then it was called the Renaissance, right? And so most people don't think about what the meaning of the word is, but it means a rebirth.
Rebirth. Right.
So the Renaissance was a rebirth of knowledge that just barely survived this period of amnesia in some key Greek texts and Roman texts, and the Islamic culture kept quite a few of these texts alive. And so when they were read and understood again in this rising period of still Kali Yuga, they began to understand water power and hydraulics. They began to understand that in all likelihood, the earth went around the sun rather than the sun went around the earth, which had become the standard understanding. Um,
Which in ancient times, in certainly Satya Yuga, but even Treta Yuga and Dvapara Yuga, that was common knowledge. We've seen evidence that they did know that the sun was at the center and we revolved around the sun.
yes, and quite a bit more in some of the um, Vedic Upanishads and Puranas and the other scriptures that followed on from the Vedas themselves. They actually described the atom,
Mhm.
described the relative size of the atom. They described planetary motions. They understood astronomy. It was really a very deep scientific knowledge, what we would think of as scientific knowledge today, of the structure of matter and of the behavior of the solar system and beyond the solar system.
Mhm.
But that never made it to Europe. So European
Uh-huh.
return to knowledge was really through what had been accumulated by the Greeks and to some extent the Egyptians, until we reached the Renaissance, and then we once again came into ascending Dwapara, where the kind of discoveries that were being made in what Sri Yukteswar refers to as kind of a transition time between Kali Yuga and Dwapara Yuga, 1700 to 1900, this 200-year period, where mankind as a whole began to once again understand that energy underlay matter. And you started to see basic discoveries about gravity, about electromagnetism, and about exploiting electricity and the laws of electromagnetism, which was really what was being worked out by the scientists in Europe of 1700 to 1900. And then in 1900, as we already shared, that was when Einstein and the scientists who had come before him were able to understand that there really is no such thing as matter, that matter is energy in another form, and thus E equals mc squared.
Yeah, so in Kali Yuga, which is the lowest one, matter is the fundamental essence of everything. And then in Dvapara Yuga, it's energy that is fundamental. And then in Treta Yuga, it's thought. And then in Satya Yuga, it's spirit or consciousness, right?
Right.
So, the question is, I think, when we hear about this descending cycle, is why did we lose all of that? How did that happen? And, I had a question when I first heard about this, because Spiritism teaches that individuals cannot regress. We don't regress. We can delay our evolution if we're not motivated to grow. We can stand still, so to speak, but we can't regress. And so in a descending cycle, it must be a great influx of younger or less developed souls that come in, and the more developed ones start to leave, graduate to maybe a higher level planet or whatever. It has to be, it's like Max Planck, the father of quantum physics, said, science progresses one funeral at a time, right? So it must be the opposite also, that it regresses also one funeral at a time, with younger souls coming in. It's the only explanation that I can come up with as to why we lost and kept going down to, and that now we're thankfully, and sometimes hard to believe, but we are in an ascending cycle now, where there is more knowledge, more awareness.
So let me kind of respond to that, because while it is true that knowledge would be lost one funeral at a time, the reason why they had that knowledge was not because it had gradually been built up in the ascending arc, but as Sri Yukteswar describes it, the consciousness of man in general is being uplifted by a outside force. And he described a sort of a mechanism for this, which involves our solar system doing kind of a do-si-do with another star. He referred to it as a dual, D-U-A-L. And that this dual star and our star were in a gravitational dance, or in a gravitational dance that describes a circle every 24,000 years. But as we are moving through that cycle, according to Sri Yukteswar, we get closer to, and then when we're closest, we begin to retreat and begin to get farther from a center of influence that he referred to as the grand central sun, or the creative seat of Brahma. And when we're closest to it, all beings on the planet of the earth, their consciousness is elevated. Or the way I think of it is that they have bodies that are refined enough to perceive spirit. And
Right.
that as we move away from that grand central sun, the refinement of the nervous system and the physical body declines, so that the people in Kali Yuga are literally not able to perceive spirit. Now, individuals in any age can, through meditation, through pranayama, through deep purification of their own nervous system, reach the point where they perceive spirit. But that mankind as a whole won't perceive spirit unless they're born into these bodies with nervous systems that are already refined. So even if the people in Satya Yuga descending arc did everything they possibly could to leave a legacy, to leave teachings, to create a tradition that would teach people what they knew in Satya Yuga, it still wouldn't necessarily be able to be used by the people coming along in Treta Yuga and Dwapara Yuga, because they just don't have the nervous systems to experience it.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, Also, many people think that when you say it came from the outside, and there's a place in the book where you talk about how our thoughts are perceived, right, are also kind of come from outside. And many people think that there were points. I mean, there have been a lot of these cycles. We've done it's not just we're in the second half of the cycle and
we're done. No,
yeah, right.
yeah.
There have been many of these cycles, like
Yes.
Which is hard to fathom in a way. But a lot of people think that there were extraterrestrial factors, right? Extraterrestrials in helping humanity evolve in different points in like a previous ascending cycle, or in Satya Yuga, or wherever. You don't mention that in the book. Is that not at all part? You do mention spirit communication, and but not that.
Well, that is another popular explanation for how there could have been higher civilizations in the past, how the people knew enough to build the pyramids to such height and precision and purpose, etc. There's pretty much everything that I have mentioned as a justification for there having been the yugas is also used by the what are called the ancient alien group to explain how they could have happened by visiting aliens. So what I tend to think, I didn't want to create a controversy within the book that people who, embrace that alternative approach more than the Yugas might take exception to. But I think it's quite possible that the evidence for alien visitors from outside our solar system could well have been us having the ability to travel outside the solar system and return. That doesn't necessarily have to mean that some civilization out there has such superior intelligence generated to ours that we would always be the poor relation recipient of superior knowledge, but that even in the remainder of ascending Dwapara Yuga, Yogananda hinted that we may develop the ability to travel through space.
Mm-hmm.
And that the subtlety of how we do that may not be the brute strength of giant rockets pushing us out of the atmosphere and then pushing us through space. We may have much more subtle ways, if for no other reason than it takes so bloody long for something to travel through space to even get to the nearest star. But one of the keynotes that Sri Yukteswar mentioned about Dwapara Yuga, ascending Dwapara Yuga, is that we would overcome all the limitations of space. So one of the key limitations of space is distance. And we've already overcome a lot of that limitation by exactly what we're doing right now. All of us are talking to each other or looking at each other, at least communicating in real time over hundreds and hundreds, thousands of miles. This could be a group that would include somebody from India, from Australia, from China, and we're communicating in real time. So in that sense, we've already overcome one of the limitations of space, which is communication at long distances. So we're just getting started with ascending Dwapara. We're only 300 years into a 2,400-year cycle. So the evidence that exists for extraterrestrial activity, say, could be our own activity.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could easily be from other civilizations in other parts of a very large universe. But all of the knowledge that is possible will be ours to discover and attain right here on Earth. We don't need it to have been extraterrestrials to help us along, but they could have. They may have brought it to us earlier than we would have discovered it on our own, etc. But it's not necessary to explain the height of civilization that we will attain. And that's why I left it out of the book. It's sort of a, could or couldn't have happened, but doesn't really matter to the main theme of the Yugas.
Yeah. So was there, I haven't read the Vedas, and I did buy Sri Yukteswar's book, but I haven't read it yet because I was busy reading your book. But is there an origin, is there a creation story behind all this? Is there, we've had so many cycles, and it seems like every day archaeologists are finding evidence of more and more ancient civilizations and cultures, and more ancient fossils of I thought the section on the Neanderthals was so interesting. But is there any origin story of how it all got started?
Well, there is the origin story that is part of Vedic teachings. And obviously, as everyone knows, there are many origin stories. You know, in the beginning was the Word, and then all of the creation was created in 7 days. There's in every tradition in the world, there is a origin story. Generally speaking, always having divinity, powers beyond sort of human understanding that are the creators of it. In the particular lineage that I'm in, which is the Vedic lineage, and Sri Yukteswar was a teacher within, the Vedic origin story is, and you've probably heard this term before, in the great picture, there are days and nights of Brahma. And the days and nights of Brahma is that all of creation is brought into being, and it plays out this enormous movie of development from billions and billions and billions of years ago until today, and will continue for billions and billions of years until there is the night of Brahma and it all comes back together. But then there's a day of Brahma following the night. There's always this cyclical aspect, just as there is with the Yugas. And there's even a lifetime of Brahma, which is calculated by various Vedic pundits to be trillions upon trillions upon trillions of years in length, from the very beginning of this creation cycle to the end of it. So Vedic teachings are nothing if not mind-blowingly vast in their conception. And all of this that we're talking about is really only part of the picture, because there are the astral regions, and that the physical cosmos, physical part of the cosmos that I'm describing from the day and the night of Brahma and the life of Brahma, all refers only to physical creation, but that the astral regions are even more vast than the conceptions of the physical creation and lasting far longer, and that the physical world is dependent for its very being on these astral worlds. The astral worlds are, where we go in between lives, and that eventually will transcend even that vastness to become one with the infinite creator behind all of that. So that's the long answer to your question. Is there an origin story? But there's not a particular origin story that I know of that works within
I was wondering,
dimension of the Yugas.
Yeah, I was wondering if the origin story had us starting at the top or at the bottom. Like the mainstream story of our culture is that we started at the bottom with cavemen, and but I sometimes wonder, because I think of humanity as essentially, our essential self is divine. Our essential self is this spiritual, divinity. There is no separation between us and the divine. And then we decided to separate. And when we decided to separate, we got this kind of amnesia, right?
Right.
And forgot who we were. And so it could be that we started at a pretty high pinnacle and then and then just descended from there, or we could have started at a low ebb and ascended from there. Anyway, I guess we're not going to have an answer to that, but I was just curious as to, yeah, whether which one came first, the chicken or the egg.
Well, the Vedic teachings, Sri Yukteswar's teachings, definitely agree with what you just said, that we are essentially one with the infinite. We are
Yeah.
divine beings, and we have descended from that high consciousness into where we are today, primarily in the delusion of separateness, that we have to
Yes.
work our way back through incarnations, and whether we incarnate again in Kali Yuga because we need to incarnate there, or in Treta Yuga, or on another planet somewhere else in the vastness of creation, we will keep, as you say, learning, become more aware of who we really are, and that illusion of separateness will gradually diminish until we will know that, not only know that we are that, but we will experience that infinitude of spirit that is our real nature.
Yeah. And it seems like it's not a, how can I say it? It's not a smooth descent or ascent. There are periods where like the axial age in Kali Yuga, right? We were already in Kali Yuga when Buddha and Lao Tzu and who else was there? It came along and kind of lifted us up and shared the the wisdom of Treta Yuga and maybe even Satya Yuga. You can that it was like a bright spot in this very dark time, right?
Right. Well, I think
Yeah.
in any age, we're going to get the blessing of teachers coming.
Yeah, but this
Whose
was like a,
teachings are shaped by that age, what people can understand, how they can
right.
progress with just the understanding they have in that age.
Yeah. And in a similar vein, we're now in this ascending cycle, but in some ways it feels like a descending cycle because it seems like we're becoming more and more polarized all the time. And, even at the same time, there are more and more people waking up, right? So there's this tension of both opposites, increasing, right? Do you want to talk about that? How there's this energy that is almost feels like it's reaching a climax, and we're in a time where more and more countries in the world are opting to be autocratic, which seems like a backward step. And so, and yet we're supposed to be in an ascending cycle.
Right. Now, I think that why that seems so counterintuitive, that we could be an ascending cycle, is that the cycle is really long. Even at the peak of Dwapara Yuga, even 2,000 years from now, there could still be war. There could still be strife. There could still be fundamental disharmony between people. It's not, Dwapara Yuga is not, in this big cycle of things, a particularly high age. So what I think you have to look for to see improvement in Dwapara Yuga is not whether there is still tension or war or polarization or autocracies, but what has improved. And if you go back to 1700 to today, there are many things that have changed for the better. I mean, we had widespread slavery around the world in 1700, and we even had it at the beginning of the 1900s, but it is gradually and pretty much inexorably going away. We have the rights of women who were universally across the world were considered to be pretty much chattel in the 1700s. And today they're rising in their equality. And I think that will keep going. An odd statistic is that fewer and fewer people are dying in wars, even though we still have lots of wars. But the kind of casualty count that they had in World War I and in World War II has never been equaled because there just are fewer and fewer casualties in wars. Now you might say, well, why are there so many wars? Why is Dwapara Yuga creating so many wars? But if you understand that's this dynamic tension that's part of Dwapara Yuga, you can understand it. But we're still inching forward in some basic ways.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting also that in the ascending cycle, the population gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
Right.
Right. Until in Satya Yuga, it's very small. And then in the descending cycle, it gets bigger and bigger.
But it's starting from a small nucleus, really, of people. And it does take thousands of years for the kind of population size to reach what it is today.
But how does it diminish? Just people having fewer children? Or is there?
Well, nobody can say absolutely for sure that our population will begin to diminish, but there are lots of signs that it will. One of them is simply that it's getting more and more expensive to have children around the world.
But in the previous cycles, like in the previous ascending the Dvapara Yuga, do you think there were as many people as we have today?
There could have been, but there might also have been fewer. There could have been natural catastrophes that knocked the population back.
Or a nuclear war
any
or
of those
two.
Descending yugas.
Yeah.
If there was another period that mirrored ours exactly, then I would expect a large population now and a diminishing population into the future of Dwapara Yuga. But I think, as Mark Twain put it, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself,
but it rhymes.
but it rhymes. So I think the yugas in the past, are rhyming, or we're rhyming with the yugas of the past. So they're not all going to be exactly the same in each 24,000 year cycle, but mankind's basic understanding, perception, will tend to make it similar in every repetition of the cycle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's see. How can spiritual traditions and modern science work together to guide humanity toward the higher consciousness characteristic of future yugas? Will they work together, or will we will they converge more and more as we realize that the technology that we rely on externally, like our cell phones and computers and all of that, we actually have within us also. And so we rely less and less on that as our own spiritual faculties grow. I mean, the Aboriginal tribes, there are Aboriginal tribes in Australia that communicate exclusively or almost exclusively telepathically. They never lost that somehow.
Mhm.
Right?
Well, I think that the level of technology we have today will, I think, continue to evolve, but I think its dominance will gradually diminish. But that dominance could remain for another 100 years or 200 years. Remember, Dwapara is really long.
Yeah.
We're only 300 years. We have 2,100 years more of Dwapara Yuga, in which this knowledge of energy and use of energy and exploitation of energy is going to be a theme. So it could go slowly, but inevitably, as the consciousness of mankind is elevated, as we're getting closer to this grand central sun of high creative consciousness, these things will change, not because science and technology working together have become wiser, but because people have become wiser.
Exactly.
And science and technology will change.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's see what time it is. Yeah, let's see if anyone else has a question or a comment. I'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. I still have questions I can ask, but anybody, while you're all thinking, before it, just click on raise hand if you have a question. Sherry has raised her hand. Go ahead, Sherry.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to comment on the lovely picture of Paramahansa Yogananda behind you.
Uh-huh.
I felt when I first came on that he was smiling at me and he was in the room. So I came across his book just by happenstance, the autobiography of a yogi.
Mm-hmm.
And I read it and it was just, I felt like this connection. And I've been a chanting Buddhist for 35 years. I chant the Lotus Sutra. So I'm familiar with energy and chanting. But I also I study A Course in Miracles, which are, I don't know if you're familiar with it, basically a psychological study of Jesus's teachings. So I kind of like to study different philosophies. And I wonder if I were going to delve a little bit more, dabble a little bit more into what you have studied, how should I begin with that?
Well, there's a lot to take in. The autobiography of a yogi is, I think, the sort of single most influential book of our time. There's thousands and thousands of people who have commented how it changed their life. It's 35 million copies and growing. But if you want to take a deep dive past that, you can look at Yogananda's basically his explanation of the Bhagavad Gita. And it's called God Talks to Arjuna. It is tremendously deep. I have read and reread it, and I still am taking in more and more all the time. If you want to kind of learn more about how his teachings are applied, Swami Kriyananda, who was my teacher here at Ananda, has written many, many books. One is called the New Path, which talks about his time with Yogananda and what he learned from Yogananda. And he has many other books that focus on, relationships, marriage, healing, etc. So if you want to see how they're sort of applied, there's a lot of those books. If you want to, as he puts it in the Bhagavad Gita interpretation, if you want to learn about the structure of creation and the nature of the creator, that I can recommend. But it is a deep dive into Vedic teachings, Vedic philosophy.
Lorraine, you have your hand up. You need to unmute. Yeah.
So two thoughts. One is, what was the most unexpected thing that you found in your research so far? Would be my first question.
Most unexpected. This may sound backwards to what you're asking, but what I expected to have to do was to unearth really esoteric, basically unaccepted evidence, that I was going to have to find it in, museum catalogs that nobody knew anything about, or, really dig beneath the surface. My surprise was that most of the major things that everybody knows, from Göbekli Tepe to the Vedas to the Great Pyramids, all actually supported the story of the Yugas very strongly. They supported the story of the Yugas much better than they support the current narrative of archaeology, that everything in past gets more and more and more primitive. It doesn't actually show that in the footprint, in the record. So that was the surprise, is that I didn't have to dig into, strange troves of knowledge that few people ever encountered.
And it seems like archaeology is just, except for it's too bad it doesn't get more funding, because there is so much. I think you said in the book that it's like a fraction of 1% that we've actually excavated, that we've actually discovered on the earth. But there's archaeology in the ocean floor and archaeology, and now they're using more and more sophisticated technology for that, and as well as remote viewing, to remote view sites where they need to dig. And that's a very interesting development also.
Yes, archaeology is definitely going through a transformation. And there is a kind of a tug of war right now between what are known as the new archaeologists, who are embracing all the latest technologies, like just radar penetration below the surface, or high level radar scanning of areas. One example of that was used in Egypt, and they discovered 100 sites that nobody even knew existed, because they could see them just below the surface of the ground using these techniques. So there's a kind of a quiet revolution going on in archaeology, because new technologies are being applied to the old. But what it's creating is a new narrative of the past. And the older established archaeologists are really not happy with this new narrative, because it's, many of them had their careers made on a certain book describing, life in Egypt in 800 BC. that is now being thrown out by these new narratives. So there's a lot of tension in archaeology now. But I do think more and more is going to be discovered. Even in America, you wouldn't think it, but even in America, there are increasing amount of evidence that we have evidence of really significantly old civilizations right in America.
I know. I was amazed. I was amazed at all of the discoveries that have been made throughout our country in Illinois and Nevada and Oklahoma, and just things that were even, hundreds of thousands of years old.
Right.
Right. Edna, you have a question?
Oh, there. Hi. Yeah, this is really interesting, and I'm enjoying your book, although I've only gotten into it a little bit. I'm here in New Mexico, and so when you were talking about the circular rooms, it made me think of Chaco Canyon, which is full of circular rooms. I don't know if they had roofs or not, but they're finding that it was a spiritual center. It wasn't really a place where people were living continually, that people would come in there. And then there's a lot of solar and universe kind of viewing point things that would happen at various times of year. So just that kind of echoes what you're saying there. We're discovering things here. And the only thing is it's pretty new compared to the Turkish site, because I looked it up, it was like 1100 AD. So that's way past when it was supposed to be, and I forget which age it is, but
Right.
I guess things could linger, right?
Yeah, and dating sites around the world is heavily influenced by the narrative of how people, in the mainstream of archaeology, what they believe is possible. And so they tend to, human nature being what it is, kind of shoehorn the evidence of a site into how old they think it could possibly be. But even in Chaco Canyon, I believe there are disagreements about some of the earliest settlements and how old they might be. So I think over time, you're also going to see, as Graham Hancock likes to put it, things keep getting older and older and older as new evidence is uncovered, and then new evidence that is uncovered by these new techniques dates it farther back.
Yeah. I have another question, if that's okay.
Okay.
So I'm just sort of building off of Gloria's question about how is it that her spiritism has things never declining, and
no, individuals don't regress, but cultures can regress.
Oh, okay. Well, so kind of my overall question is, like, we can take teachings from more than one place. So, I mean, maybe any one thing is sort of incomplete, but we could put things together, because I was remembering about the Akashic record, which kind of says all knowledge is there. It's not going to disappear. It's just we don't always know it as individuals. So just the idea of combining wisdom from different teachings.
Well, I think all the teachings that we're talking about here all have that high goal of getting us to the point where we are the expression of the teachings. We don't necessarily need the teachings anymore. We become one with spirit. And in that eventuality, then tapping into the Akashic record or just our own inner intuition, we just know directly. We don't have to be taught those things. And that is a matter of our own personal spiritual journey that we'll gradually learn more and more and more. and we might learn, we might incarnate 200 years in the future from where we are now, because we can learn something experientially that is going to shape what we understand, and particularly what we perceive, because there's an opportunity there for us to do it. We might learn it by going to another planet. We're in a perpetual forward motion as a soul, but where we land to learn our lessons could change all the time. We don't necessarily progress along with the yugas. If the lessons we need to learn are Dwapara lessons, then we're going to keep incarnating in wherever in the universe
Forever
in Dwapara Yuga in order to keep learning it. We don't get to kind of ride the arc to realization, you know?
Right. And that upholds the idea of, one funeral at a time, whether it's ascending or descending. It's like the descending cycle would be younger souls coming in, and the older souls, more developed, more evolved souls going to a more evolved place. And so the culture goes down, but the individual doesn't regress, you see?
Right. Or even go down to a lower incarnation. They're done with their lifetime and on they go.
Exactly.
Thank you. That was a lovely answer. Thank you so much.
Lorraine, okay, we'll get to you. Serena, Lorraine's had her hand up for quite a while.
So I'm out here in Colorado. I've actually been down to Chaco and find it one of the most emotional places I've ever been. I love going there. I'm also part of an EDGE science group out here. We had a meeting today on the sound healing with sound through the use of vibration. And one of the topics that came up during the presentation is, how are the pyramids constructed? And I've heard before on more than one occasion that there is some belief and perhaps credible evidence that they were created through the use of vibration, moving the blocks. And I don't know, hopefully I'm doing this accurately enough that I'm not misspeaking. That it was done through the use of vibration to move these massive pieces of stone, and that there is no known modern technology that could create the pyramids with the precision in which they are constructed, and that is a proposed construction method. I'm curious if that makes any sense based on your
Especially
research.
The Great Pyramid, right? The Great Pyramid.
The Great Pyramid, well, the three that are together there, the Great Pyramids, all kind of share a level of sophistication. First, let me say, I don't actually know. I don't have any, really insider knowledge on which of the many, many ideas that have been proposed for how the pyramids were built is actually the right one. The ones I'm drawn to as what I suspect is more likely would involve things like using sound in a way that is beyond anything we understand today, or having adept, highly advanced people who could literally levitate stones into position, or shape them and then levitate them into position. But as you say, and as thousands of people, millions of people have said, the precision in the construction of the Great Pyramids is not something we can equal today. And there have been many attempts to build like little versions of the pyramid, and they fail to match the precision of the pyramid today. It is an extraordinary structure. It up until 1600 AD, it was the tallest construction in the world. 5,000 years it lasted as the tallest construction on the earth. So it is astonishing in many, many ways. And I think that I'd love to know exactly how it was built, but I think it may be, all of the suppositions that are made, like it could have been built with sound energy, they could all be true. It could be so many things combined and brought to a level of high usefulness all together in order to build it.
Serena, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Gloria. Joseph, this has been extraordinary. I'm so happy to have heard this. I want to hear it again. I ordered your book. And just one brief thing about what Lorraine mentioned about the sound and the pyramids. I have read somewhere that the knowledge that came to the Egyptians was from Atlantis, but that's probably for another story. But what, but I think what I wanted to ask you, Joseph, you mentioned the Yugas, of course, okay. And then you mentioned, I got kind of excited, okay, that the Yuga we're in, where we are now, is on an up chapter.
Yeah.
And I'm a professional astrologer. I do Hindu, Vedic, blah, blah, blah. I'm a therapist. You don't want to hear the rest of me. But I've been hearing from my different, spiritual connections that we have a new generation coming into the earth right now who are of a higher level. That I'm thinking, I hope that matches the Yugas. What does Joseph think?
Yeah, I definitely think that the younger people coming in, the generations, I don't even know what to call the latest generation.
They're called A. It was
A?
Gen X, X, Y, Z, and then we're starting at the beginning of the alphabet.
Going back to the beginning of the alphabet. So Gen A.
Yeah. I know
I think that they are
Gen A.
sophisticated. They're how to put it, what they have available to them to choose from, spiritual teachings, professional training, understanding of culture and society, how they see the best way in which society could function. I think they're all basing it on very elevated understanding, far beyond what my friends and I were kicking around when I was in college.
I know, right.
I think that, and I think that does come. I mean, I'm obviously predisposed to think this, but I do think it comes from them having a degree of elevated consciousness that allows them to have that perspective on things. So I definitely think there are a lot of reasons to believe that things are getting better. I think they're just getting better very, very slowly, but that they are getting better.
It could be that the consciousness of the people who are, being born now is potentially more refined, but our educational system seems to be going backwards.
Oh, because they're on their tablet all the time.
Because what?
They're on their tablets all the time.
Yeah.
Well, I sort of see that when I went to school, and I won't tell you when or how long ago, but when I went to school, what you could learn was very narrow. What was presented to you as an option. And now with the internet and online learning,
that's true.
The exposure that Gen A, Gen Z, Gen Y, etc. were born into, gives them a picture of the pool of knowledge that's, literally thousands of times larger.
Yes, but that's not the educational system. That's the internet.
But that's how people actually learn. The educational system, does its best But
Okay.
how people actually learn, what they take in and
Yeah.
absorb, comes from their friends, comes from what they're
Mhm.
exposed to.
Yeah, definitely, no doubt about it. They're exposed to a million times more than we were.
And
Right.
that's
Yeah.
the problem for the educational systems. I have many friends who are, professional educators who have PhDs in the process of education and how people learn, et cetera.
Hmm.
And what they say is a common complaint among certainly the world of public education is things are changing so fast that educators don't know what basic set of knowledge they should try to teach because it seems to get outmoded practically before there are textbooks or lesson plans to use to teach it. And that more and more what they're coming to is that if formal schooling has a long-term place in society and culture, it would be to teach people how to learn.
Yeah.
Mm.
And then turn them loose to go learn what they're going to learn, what they're drawn to. Maybe that means they're drawn to college X or college Y or trade school or things that don't even have a structure yet that they would go and find out. And I sort of feel sorry for education today because they're doing their best. But there's a tremendous inertia, obviously, to teaching. It's no longer quite this, but the equivalent of reading, writing, and arithmetic, which of the three R's, only one of them is actually spelled with an R, by the way. But I think it's evolving so fast that nobody knows where it's going to go because there's just so much information out there and so many ways to access it and assimilate it.
It's amazing.
But it's just drawing. Lorraine, you have a question?
If I remember correctly in this program this evening, the word primitive came up to describe people who lived, however many thousands of years ago. And there's certainly a part of me that feels that that is not accurate in the sense of they were so much more connected to the natural world. And to me, in that way, they were actually so much more empowered than we were. What do I want to say? And so to me, they were not primitive at all. They were actually ever so much more astute, alive, connected to the natural world and the processes and the plants.
What period are you specifically referring to?
Well, I appreciate what you're saying and what you mean, Lorraine. And I've had this discussion in various contexts with people. And I think that the distinction that I would make is that there are people today who are born into a more innate, instinctive attunement to nature. And I think that this is a real phenomenon, but I don't think it's necessarily spiritual. That we evolve in our many, many incarnations from our animal incarnations. And in our animal incarnations, we were very attuned to nature. If we weren't very, very attuned to nature, we died. And that in and of itself was a survival thing, but it's not God realization. It's attunement to a limited expression of all of creation. Where as we grow in our spiritual direction, what we're tuning into in meditation and tuning into through the use of tools like pranayama is the spirit within us beyond nature that created nature, that encompasses nature, and that when we tune into that, we may actually lose the kind of innate attunement to Mother Nature and the sounds of the birds and the meaning of, signs, etc., which is part of that more basic attunement. We may lose that in this seemingly greater sophistication and then regain it, if you will, in complete realization of oneness with God, because we understand everything at that point.
I think as we attune more spiritually, as we advance more spiritually, we may lose the kind of relationship that we have now, which is mostly a projection onto nature of our own, how we see nature, but we see it more as we attune more to the divinity and higher levels of spiritual attunement. We also can see it more revealed in nature. The idea of parentheum. What is it? I can't think of the term now. But where we can see, we look at a tree now and it's a projection of what we think the tree is, right? Or what it represents to us. But when we are in that state of oneness with the cosmos, with nature, with everything, then we see the essence of everything, the essence of including nature. That's how I see it. Panentheism, that's what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Not pantheism, but panentheism, where it's anyway, that's how I see it. It's a different relationship, nature, and maybe some, oops, somebody just fell off and came back. Anyway, that's just my take. We develop a different relationship. Catherine, you had your hand up. You need to unmute. There we go.
Thank you. And I really apologize for not being here earlier. I'm so sorry that I missed a lot of that.
I'll send you the video.
But that said, what I'm hearing is that we're kind of talking at cross purposes in some ways, because maybe we're not clear about what it means to be spiritual with nature and what that really looks like. I think there's been, in my view, some confusion in our culture about that for a very long time, when we decided that spirituality was more special than understanding our own bodies or being connected to our own bodies or using our bodies as a means of understanding the world, that it was all mental and all somehow up here in the air and not at all connected to the physicalness. And in my own experience, there's a huge amount of spirituality that comes with an embodied understanding of both myself and the rest of the living beings on the planet. And part of that comes from understanding that there are living beings on the planet with consciousness as well. So seeing those living beings as not living beings, but things, is a different understanding of what spirituality might be, where if you or feel that living beings are sentient, do have consciousness, are responsive, and you can interact with that consciousness and be aware of that consciousness, then that shifts the understanding of what spirituality might be in those cases. So I'm kind of hearing two different conversations around that here in the responses, just my observation.
Okay.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I ventured off into saying that spirituality is a higher form of awareness than just attunement to nature. I knew that was going to get me in trouble, but I don't mean it to denigrate sensitivity, attunement to nature. I merely mean to say that it's more. It's an attunement to subtle realities, to your subtle energy body, to the astral regions, to the creator of all, and to the infinite consciousness that is inherent in all of creation. That if you just stay attuned to nature, you're going to limit yourself. But if you go beyond and beyond, you won't leave attunement to nature behind, but you become more aware and more aware of a greater reality. So I may have said it poorly, but maybe I said it
No,
better.
it's kind of, that's kind of what I was saying too. I think first you have to transcend, in order to reach certain levels of consciousness, but then you can see that consciousness in everything, including nature, in everything, revealed in everything, right? Because everything has been, part of that, is part of that. So is that what you're saying, Joseph?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody? I think we're out of time. Let me see. Yes, we are. We're out of time. And Joseph, thank you so much for coming. There is so much more. I just encourage everybody to read this book because it really is very fascinating, the Yugas. And there is so much documented evidence and scientific evidence, archaeological evidence to substantiate what is said here. So please get a copy and you'll have fun reading it. So thank you. Thank you so much, Joseph. And thank you all for attending. And we will see you next time.
All right. God bless.
God bless.